On a Wednesday afternoon in early April 2026, a rocket taller than a 30-story office building thundered off a launch pad in Florida, carrying 4 people farther away from Earth than any human being had traveled in more than 50 years. This was Artemis II, the first crewed flight of NASA's new Orion spacecraft, and it arrived after years of setbacks, redesigns, and an earlier uncrewed test flight that had turned up serious problems needing to be resolved first. What played out across the following 10 days became one of the most significant human spaceflight achievements since the Apollo era, a genuine return to deep space after a half-century absence, and the specifics of exactly how it unfolded are worth walking through in order, because almost nothing about this mission was improvised. 4 astronauts rode aboard Orion. Reid Wiseman commanded the mission, Victor Glover served as pilot, and Christina Koch flew as a mission specialist, all 3 representing NASA. The 4th seat belonged to Jeremy Hansen of the Canadian Space Agency, also serving as a mission specialist, making him the first person from outside the United States ever to travel beyond low Earth orbit toward the Moon. Their spacecraft carried the name Integrity and sat mounted atop NASA's Space Launch System, the enormous SLS rocket that had already flown once before without a crew during the Artemis II mission back in 2022. This time, 4 human beings were strapped inside. Launch day itself went about as smoothly as anyone could have hoped for a rocket, with the SLS's reputation for scrubbed countdowns and stubborn fuel leaks. Heading into that Wednesday, plenty of observers braced for delays. Instead, after engineers resolved a minor concern involving a battery reading tied to the launch abort system, quickly determined to be a faulty sensor rather than an actual hardware fault, and once weather conditions improved through the day, the countdown ran cleanly from start to finish. Liftoff came at 6:35 p.m. Eastern Time, comfortably inside the opening portion of a 2-hour launch window. Even pilot Victor Glover later admitted, speaking from orbit, that the sheer smoothness of the countdown had genuinely surprised the crew, since an SLS launch going that well on the very first try isn't something anyone takes for granted. Once safely in orbit, Orion spent roughly its first full day circling Earth, giving flight controllers time to run through spacecraft checks before committing to the journey toward the Moon. During that early phase, the solar array wings extending from Orion's European-built service module, the component responsible for powering and propelling the spacecraft, unfolded completely and locked into place, immediately beginning to generate electrical power. Fully extended, those wings gave the spacecraft a wingspan of about 63 feet. With systems confirmed healthy, controllers gave the green light for the mission's first truly critical maneuver, the translunar injection burn, executed the following day, which committed Orion to leaving Earth orbit for good and heading outward toward the Moon. Somewhere around this burn, one of the crew members captured a particularly striking photograph looking back toward Earth, showing a pair of glowing auroras near the planet's poles, a faint band of zodiacal light as Earth briefly passed in front of the Sun in the frame, and even Venus visible in the same shot. The days that followed made up what NASA referred to as the outbound coast, the multi-day stretch covering the roughly 250,000-mile gap between Earth and the Moon. Far from idle downtime, this period was packed with tests specifically designed to check systems that the uncrewed Artemis Weiner flight simply had no way to validate without actual people aboard. The astronauts practiced manually flying Orion, temporarily taking control away from its automated systems, tested communications at lunar range, and rehearsed trajectory correction procedures. Christina Koch was photographed during this stretch, gazing out one of Orion's main cabin windows, watching Earth recede as the crew pressed onward. There were lighter moments too, including a video call with Canadian schoolchildren, a fitting touch given Jeremy Hansen's role as the mission's international astronaut and a small physical keepsake the crew brought along, an Apollo 8 silk patch that had already flown to the Moon once before with astronaut Jim Lovell, who had recorded a personal wake-up message for the Artemis II crew shortly before his death the previous year. Then came April 6th, 6 days into the flight, and the day that became the unmistakable centerpiece of the entire mission. Just before 1 p.m. Central Time, the crew crossed 248,755 miles from Earth, officially eclipsing the record for the farthest distance any human being had ever traveled from the planet, a marking that had stood untouched since Apollo 13 set it back in 1970. From there, Orion pressed on toward its closest pass by the Moon, swinging around its far side, the hemisphere permanently hidden from view on Earth, giving the astronauts a direct, unaided look at terrain no human eye had ever taken in before, previously seen only through robotic spacecraft imagery. As Orion closed in, NASA noted the Moon would appear to the crew roughly the size of a basketball held at arm's length. More than halfway through the flyby, Orion slipped behind the Moon and entered a scheduled 40-minute communications blackout, the same predictable radio silence that occurred during Apollo missions and Artemis I alike, caused simply by the Moon physically standing between the spacecraft and NASA's deep space network on Earth. It was during that blackout, invisible to live tracking, that Orion actually reached its closest point to the lunar surface, passing about 4,067 miles above the ground at a relative speed to the Moon of roughly 3,139 miles per hour, even though its speed relative to Earth remained much faster, 60,163 miles per hour. 2 minutes later, still hidden behind the Moon, Orion reached the mission's outright maximum distance from Earth, 756 miles, more than 4,000 miles past the old Apollo 13 mark, briefly making the 4 people aboard the most distant human beings from Earth in recorded history. When Orion finally swung back into view from behind the Moon, Mission Control in Houston reacquired the signal quickly and restored full contact with the crew. What followed wasn't a routine instrument check so much as one of the most memorable stretches of the entire flight. The astronauts narrated the lunar terrain sliding beneath them in real time, at one point pointing out 2 small, previously unnamed craters near the sprawling Oriental Basin, an impact structure nearly 400 miles wide, straddling the boundary between the Moon's near and far sides, and comparing it to the older, more weathered Hertzsprung Basin nearby. Pilot Victor Glover remarked that some of the lunar peaks below looked almost snow-covered under the harsh, shadowless sunlight. The crew photographed the surface extensively, switching between professional digital cameras and, in a detail that drew plenty of attention afterward, their own personal phones. They also witnessed and photographed an Earthrise, deliberately attempting to recreate the iconic image captured during Apollo 8, along with an hour-long solar eclipse as Earth briefly blocked the sun from their vantage point. Later that evening, President Donald Trump placed a congratulatory call to the crew aboard Orion following the flyby. With the lunar portion of the mission behind them, Orion exited the Moon's sphere of gravitational influence and began the multi-day journey home. The return trip wasn't purely passive, either. Over the following days, the crew and mission controllers worked through a series of planned trajectory correction burns spaced across the return leg, fine-tuning Orion's path toward Earth. The crew got one scheduled off-duty rest day partway through the trip back, followed by a day devoted to more hands-on work, and including a demonstration of how they would assemble an emergency radiation shelter inside the capsule if a solar event demanded it, along with additional manual piloting drills. In one lighthearted exchange during their return leg, flight controllers in Houston sent up what NASA joked was likely the longest person-to-person message in human history, and the crew also took part in a ship-to-ship style call with the expedition crew currently stationed aboard the International Space Station, briefly linking together 2 active NASA human spaceflight missions in real time. On April 10th, the mission's 10th day, the astronauts suited up in their spacesuits and compression garments ahead of the flight's most physically punishing phase, re-entry. At roughly 400,000 feet in altitude, about 122,000 meters up, Orion's European-built service module, having powered and propelled the spacecraft throughout the entire mission, separated from the crew module, its work finished. The capsule then slammed into the atmosphere at a scorching 40,000 kilometers per hour, close to 25,000 miles per hour, or about Mach 33. Generating enough atmospheric friction to briefly wrap the capsule in a sheath of superheated plasma as it rapidly decelerated. A carefully sequenced parachute deployment then took over to bring Orion down safely. 2 drogue parachutes first slowed the capsule to roughly 480 kilometers per hour, followed by 3 smaller pilot parachutes, and finally 3 large main parachutes that eased the descent down to a gentle 27 kilometers per hour, about 17 miles per hour, right before splashdown. At 7:53 p.m. Eastern Time, Orion splashed down in the Pacific Ocean off the coast of San Diego, closing out a journey NASA calculated at approximately 695,081 miles total, covering launch, the outbound trip, the lunar farside flyby, and the full return home. Recovery crews retrieved the capsule and all 4 astronauts, Reid Wiseman, Victor Glover, Christina Koch, and Jeremy Hansen, safely, bringing NASA's first crewed deep space mission in over 50 years to a successful close. Pulling back from the day-by-day sequence, it's worth being precise about what Artemis II was actually built to accomplish, because unlike the Apollo missions of decades past, this flight was never intended to attempt a lunar landing. Artemis II was explicitly a test flight designed to confirm that Orion, along with its life support, navigation, communications, and re-entry systems, could safely carry a human crew through an entire lunar distance mission before NASA commits astronauts to an actual surface landing. Every major event across the 10 days, the translunar injection burn, the manual piloting exercises, the trajectory corrections, the radiation shelter drill, and above all, the high-speed re-entry and splashdown existed specifically to catch any remaining problems with human-rated hardware that the uncrewed Artemis I flight in 2022 simply had no way to reveal without people actually aboard. That framing matters because Artemis I hadn't gone perfectly. That earlier uncrewed test turned up genuine concerns, particularly around Orion's heat shield, which showed unexpected patterns of char loss and cracking during re-entry that took NASA engineers a significant amount of time to fully diagnose and correct before officials felt comfortable putting a crew on the next flight. The years separating Artemis I from Artemis II were spent largely working through exactly that kind of troubleshooting, along with further delays connected to environmental control systems and batteries in the launch abort system, the same general category of hardware that briefly raised a flag during Artemis II's own countdown before being cleared as a non-issue. Getting Artemis II off the pad on April 1, 2026, after slipping past earlier target windows in February and March, marked the finish line of that entire multi-year process of identifying problems and proving they'd been fixed. With Artemis II now complete and engineers combing through its data, NASA's focus shifts toward Artemis III. The mission expected to attempt an actual crewed lunar landing using one or more commercially built landers developed through private industry partnerships. Beyond that sits Artemis IV, slated to become the first crewed moon landing since Apollo 17 back in 1972, with astronauts carrying out scientific fieldwork on the surface before heading home, followed by Artemis V, intended to land another two-person crew on the moon and begin constructing the earliest pieces of a permanent lunar outpost. NASA has said it hopes to settle into roughly annual missions from Artemis V onward, part of a broader ambition not just to revisit the moon the way Apollo once did, but to establish a lasting human presence there, using everything learned across the Artemis program as a stepping stone toward an eventual crewed mission to Mars. For now, though, the simplest summary is also the most historic one. 4 astronauts, 3 American and 1 Canadian, traveled farther from Earth than any humans in history, swept past the moon's far side close enough to glimpse terrain never seen with the naked eye before, put a brand new human-rated spacecraft through every critical phase of deep space flight, and returned home safely to a Pacific Ocean splashdown after 10 days away. Artemis II never put boots on lunar soil, and it was never meant to. What it did prove, with real people strapped inside rather than sensors and software alone, is that NASA's newest generation of deep space hardware genuinely works, clearing away the single biggest obstacle still standing between the Artemis program and an actual crewed landing on the moon for the first time since 1972. It's worth taking a moment to appreciate the sheer scale of the rocket that made all of this possible. Fully stacked with Orion riding on top, the Space Launch System stands roughly 322 feet tall, and at the moment of liftoff, it produces around 8.8 million pounds of thrust, more than 15% greater than the thrust generated by the Saturn V rockets that once carried Apollo crews toward the moon. That thrust comes from 4 RS-25 engines mounted on the rocket's core stage, engines whose design traces directly back to the Space Shuttle program, working alongside 2 solid rocket boosters attached to either side, also descended from shuttle-era hardware. Sitting atop that entire stack was an interim cryogenic propulsion stage, which fired once the core stage and boosters had finished their job, delivering the final push that sent Orion out of Earth orbit and toward the moon during the translunar injection burn. Understanding just how much raw power was involved in launching 4 people off the ground and pointing them toward the moon helps explain why NASA scrutinized every phase of ascent and every burn afterward with such intense care throughout the flight. The 4 small CubeSats that hitched a ride alongside Orion deserve a mention too, even though their mission unfolded almost entirely separately from the astronauts' own journey. Developed through partnerships with international space agencies that signed onto the Artemis Accords, the diplomatic framework governing peaceful cooperation in lunar exploration, these compact satellites, each roughly the size of a briefcase, deployed into a highly elliptical Earth orbit once released from the SLS rocket's upper stage. From there, they carried out independent scientific research and technology demonstrations at varying distances from Earth, a quieter secondary layer of the mission running in parallel with the headline-grabbing crewed lunar flyby taking place at its center. It's also worth remembering just how long a road led up to this single 10-day mission. NASA first laid out the Artemis program in the late 2010s, and both the SLS rocket and the Orion spacecraft that flew this mission had individually been in development for well over a decade before Artemis II ever left the ground, with engineering roots stretching back through years of budget fights, design revisions, and testing delays that predate the Artemis name entirely. Along the way, the program inherited hardware and expertise from the retired Space Shuttle fleet, built on international partnerships forged through the International Space Station, and weathered multiple changes in political leadership in Washington, each administration bringing its own views on how quickly and in what direction America's return to the moon should move. Viewed against that backdrop, the smoothness of Artemis II's actual flight, a clean countdown, a well-executed lunar flyby, and a precise splashdown, looks less like an easy win and more like the payoff of an unusually long, occasionally rocky development process, finally coming together exactly when it needed to. Taken as a whole, Artemis II delivered almost exactly what NASA needed from it. A clean launch, a smooth outbound journey, A record-setting and visually unforgettable lunar flyby, a string of successfully completed tests that Artemis IV simply couldn't have run without a crew aboard, and a safe, on-target splashdown to bring it all home. The mission's real achievement wasn't any single dramatic instant, so much as the steady accumulation of dozens of smaller ones, each unremarkable in isolation, adding up across 10 days into solid proof that human beings can once again leave Earth safely, travel to the moon and back, and return home in one piece, aboard an entirely new generation of spacecraft built specifically to eventually carry the next crew all the way down to the lunar surface itself.